What Plato says is that a human being has three dimensions. There's the senses, the sensorial domain, and then there is the emotional dimension, and there's the intellectual. And so if you see Prabhupada's simple program, the kirtan gets your emotions going. You can sing, you can dance, and so on. And then there's a class which engages your intelligence, philosophy, and then refreshments. And there's some spiritual food. So I really believe in Prabhupada's simple program, just done very boldly. Prabhupada was amazingly straightforward. I mean, no one would have gone to New York in 1966 and said, if you say you are God, G-O-D, you are dog, D-O-G. I mean, no one would say that. Prabhupada said what no one else had the courage to say. And I mean, I love Prabhupada's melodies. And I just think, the Hare Krishna mantra is just, I think it's just completely mesmerizing. It's the most enchanting, attractive sounds in the world. And philosophy, if you actually understand Bhagavad Gita, okay, warning, infomercial. In like in the Gita guide, of course, Prabhupada is ultimately understands it better than anyone. But what you understand from the books also depends on what you bring to it. So, for example, you can say that in Vedic culture there was monarchy. Whoops, forget establishing Vedic political culture. But actually, what kind of monarchy was it? There are many different kinds. Number one, it was a constitutional monarchy. The king, it was not absolute monarchy like Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi. It was actually a constitutional democracy. Another thing is, kings there was a balance of power, just like in modern democracies, there's the legislative branch, there's the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Well, there were different branches in Vedic culture also. The Brahmins were the teachers. They were like the ultimate judges. And then the king had executive power. And as far as legislative power, they had what is called a sabha. There was a royal assembly in which qualified people would, vote and help to decide what was to be done. So so if you're just thinking, off with their heads, like in, Alice in Wonderland, that's the king. That's not what it was. It was a very balanced constitutional monarchy in which, by the way, it was completely legal to criticize the government. You could go to the center of the city and just criticize the king, and that was not a crime. The king could not punish you for that. Just like Rama heard someone criticizing Sita. And it's not that he went and cut the man's head off. Or, for example, when Duryodhana, with the approval of Dhritarashtra, tried to assassinate the Pandavas in a house of lac, and everyone thought the Pandavas were dead. And when the news came back to Hastinapur, the people were furious. They were outraged, and they actually went into right in the center of the town, and they were cursing the king. So what did Dhritarashtra say? Send out the army? No. He said to his son, we better be much more careful, or the people are going to kick us out. In other words, the people had the power to simply dethrone a monarch. And the monarch could not criticize them because they were criticizing the government. So it's a very different kind of government that we may have in mind. Also interesting, I'm not giving any suggestions, but it is a fact that in the Western world, including America, more and more people are not at all satisfied with democracy and think it doesn't work. all you get is little corrupt political mafias. So, but again, if you don't bring some knowledge of political science to the Bhagavatam, you won't look for any of it. You won't understand any of it. So, I mean, it's not that everyone has to be an intellectual, and that would be a pretty miserable world. But ISKCON is supposed to, Prabhupada said he came to start a Brahmin movement. You know, there's an old saying that follow the money trail and you'll find the rat. You know, like in criminology. See, trilha do dinheiro vai achar o rato. So, I'm not accusing anyone of being a rat. But Prabhupada said very, very, very clearly that the train runs on two tracks: Bhagavad Gita, philosophy, teaching, and Pancharatra Gita, deity worship. He said both are necessary, but the teaching is more important. And the deity worship is to keep us Krishna conscious, to keep us, because when you go out to preach, it's like you're the person that knows everything. You're the one that's taking the position of teaching. And so we could become very proud. But when we come before the deities, we have to bow down. We have to be humble. We have to be clean. You can't always be strictly clean when you're out on the street preaching. So it's a balance. The deity worship keeps us Brahminical. But ultimately, the purpose is the preaching. So I have a simple question. In the last 10 or 20 years, how much has ISKCON spent on grand temples for puja? And how much has ISKCON spent on education? How many schools are there in ISKCON Europe? I don't know of any.
The college in Brussels and Belgium.
No, you need to take a look at the website and see what it is.
In India, you can see that right, there's so many more and more temples and great pujaris, and everything is based on ISKCON is very powerful. It's very different from West. Nothing to compare. But it's totally Indianized, if I can talk like this. It's their culture, like you said.
Yes, and
so that's the problem for the ISKCON all, because different culture. How do you manage to keep this thing together? Like you said.
Yeah, because ISKCON is not. Prabhupada said the most important service is knowledge, teaching. Can you imagine, after all these years in Europe, no schools? In Latin America, where there are thousands of devotees, how many schools? Fire sacrifices, yes. Rituals, yes. You know, it's not rich like Europe, but Europe or America, so many temples. Where's the education? It's interesting because Prabhupada, I mean, someone has to say this. I'm speaking as a loyal member of ISKCON. No one quotes the first people. Famous for learn the truth by approach master. The first word of the Sanskrit is that. So in Portuguese or English or Sanskrit, when you get a sentence with that, the question is, what is that? And that is the previous, where Krishna says certainty through education and knowledge is much better than certainty of rituals. But no one quotes that. So there's a term in English, a mission drift. Is watching because they're starting to seek us out. I grew up in Southern California, And where I live, the nearest beach we go in the summer was Santa Monica. Does anyone know what Santa Monica was?
California.
Well, no, I mean that's the beach. Yeah, but the original Santa Saint Monica, it was the mother of Augustine, who better not get started on Augustine and all of his terrible ideas. But so we used to go to the beach, and in Southern California with all the surfing, and the tide is very strong. And so every time I went to the beach, you know, I go with my friends in the summer, and you go in the water and swimming, catching waves. Jacaré, they call it in Brazil. Yeah. So we'd and then after maybe 10, 15 minutes, you turn around and look, and you were like 100 yards, 100 meters away from you started because of the undertow. And so that's the Hare Krishna movement. It's not where it started. I mean, fortunately, we still follow Prabhupada. We still have a reference point. But ISKCON is in desperate need of correction, course correction. Desperate need of a course correction. The fact that in Europe there's so many devotees, so many intelligent people, and no schools. No schools. Latin America, same thing. Fortunately, in America, there are 3 good schools, 2 in Alaska and 1 in Dallas. But so, if you really love ISKCON, I think we need to clean things up philosophically in terms of what is at the center of ISKCON. There's, you know, if we want to say, what I think sometimes is because of all the time I spent with Prabhupada, if somehow or other, let's say Prabhupada just came back. Let's say he came back, he went to America, that's where he was trying to go just before he left this world. And let's say if I or you had the service of taking him around to all his North American temples. I can't imagine how heartbroken you would be, how devastated he would be, that there hardly are any Western temples in North America. I mean, people of Indian background, they're wonderful devotees. They're not doing it wrong, they're doing everything right. I mean, you can't blame someone who's doing what they're supposed to do. So it's not, I mean, they're great souls, which I try to emphasize. The point is, where's the leadership? What's the plan? Remember that song by the Beatles, Revolution? We don't want to see the plan. Where's the plan? There's no clear, structured, explicit plan to revive Western preaching upon which the whole world depends. And there's no plan. Yes.
Is there a way to reconcile both?
Of course. Yes, the temples are beautiful. You know, devotees coming from an Indian background, they're great souls, they're people. My personal experience with them, they're very Krishna conscious, they're generous, they're kind, they're hospitable, they're wonderful people. They're not doing anything wrong. They're doing what they're supposed to do. But the point is, where's the leadership? Where's the plan? You know, so I presented a plan, which was nice. You know, it's the only plan on the table. It's the only, and you know, unfortunately, it is unfortunate. The last living Christian movement trained by Prabhupada was a West that's still active in the West. And so I made a plan based on, you know, serious academic study of the history of religions, based on a study of Shastra, based on a study of Prabhupada's teachings. That was seen as something kind of threatening.
So what is the main purpose of Krishna life?
To agitate other devotees. Okay. The main purpose is to rebuild Prabhupada's Western mission. There's not going to be a successful Western Hare Krishna movement when we give people bad philosophy, such as that. Okay, I'll give you an example. We're having a lot of success. I did a lot more work in Latin America, Brazil. So there, I mean, the average devotees that are joining there, and a lot are joining, say Krishna West, you know, they're doctors, lawyers, college professors, psychologists. So if someone has a better idea, thank God, because I can retire. I just want to, you know, go write books, live a nice Hare Krishna community at my age. So we have to somehow or other, if you're intelligent, I mean, you know, well, there are many intelligent devotees. We have to know sociology, we have to know history, we have to know psychology. Prabhupada said, and oh, do you have the first canto here? So I want to read a verse in purport that will hopefully answer the question.
But can we have one at the exclusion of the other? That's the real.
No. For example, I am a guru in the Hare Krishna movement. That's scary, isn't it? So, I mean, the fact is that Prabhupada gave his permission and blessing to devotees who want to wear devotees or saris, you know, Prabhupada allowed that. So I can't forbid for my disciples what Prabhupada permitted. I have no right to tell my disciples you can't do that. And yet there are people in ISKCON who are supposed to be leaders who forbid what Prabhupada permitted. I've written essays, which I can send to you, where there's just dozens of statements from Prabhupada, thank you. Dozens of statements from Prabhupada permitting and encouraging what I'm doing in Krishna West. And yet there are leaders who forbid what Prabhupada permitted. On what authority? And it's actually quite common, you know, whether it's gurus or GCs that forbid what Prabhupada permitted and even encouraged. So, anyway, I want to read a verse for you. And it's Prabhupada's purport, because I take great pleasure in fault finding. So let's see. Oh, that's not it. That's the index. I have to find the verse index. Oh, is this such an old book? It doesn't have, oh, there it is. Oh, 522. First canto, chapter 5, text 22, which is very interesting. About what you do with so-called mundane knowledge. By the way, the first letter Prabhupada ever wrote to me, which became my life purpose. I was a student at Berkeley. And I wrote Prabhupada a letter. It's funny, I asked the temple president, you know, should I stay important? And I said, I don't know. That's the regional secretary. So I asked the regional secretary, who was a Brahmana. I'm sorry, a brahmachari named Jamal Krishna. So I asked him, what should I do? And he said, I don't know, ask Prabhupada. So that's what this was. This was 1969. I don't know, ask Prabhupada. So I wrote Prabhupada a letter, and he wrote back to me. He said, yeah, you have to finish your education, because if you want to preach to intelligent people, or, you know, if you want to preach, I think, to educated people, you have to be well educated. He didn't say just read my books. And of course I was. He didn't say just read my books. He said, if you want to effectively preach to educated people, you must be educated. And so the idea that, so here's a very, let me read the verse in purport, because here Prabhupada is saying that so-called mundane education engaged in Krishna service is needed to save human society, which is not broadcast so much. There's all kinds of interesting things in Prabhupada's books. They're just not, you don't hear them a lot in classes. So the Sanskrit is etc. Prabhupada's translation, this is 1.522. Learned circles have positively concluded that the infallible purpose of the advancement of knowledge, namely austerity, study of the Vedas, sacrifice, chanting, and charity, culminates. And Prabhupada is going to expand this list a lot into typical university topics in his purport. But this knowledge culminates. It doesn't mean you jump to the culmination. In the transcendental descriptions of the Lord who is defined in choice poetry. Here's what Prabhupada says about this. What is, our schools just slaughterhouses? Or, what do we do with this massive system of higher education in Europe, all over the world? Prabhupada says, human intellect is developed for advancement of learning in art, science, philosophy, physics, chemistry, psychology. This is kind of the whole curriculum, isn't it? Economics, politics, etc. Now listen to this. By culture of such knowledge, human society can attain perfection. That's not something you hear every day in a Sunday feast lecture. By cultivation of such knowledge, human society can attain perfection of life. This perfection of life culminates in the realization of the Supreme Being Vishnu. So what does the word culminate mean? What it means is that you do the other things, but if you do them right, it culminates. Yane parisamahyate. You know that verse in Gita? Yane parisamahyate, where Krishna says that the importance of knowledge, because everything culminates in understanding. And then Prabhupada says, the Shruti therefore directs that those who are actually advanced in learning should aspire for the service of Lord Vishnu. And then, of course, if you're in Maya, that won't work for you. When advancement knowledge, higher education, is applied to the Lord, the whole process becomes absolute. That means getting a good education, understanding history, understanding philosophy, understanding all these things. When it's applied in Krishna's service, the whole process is absolute. If you are a serious devotee of Krishna and you pursue higher education, that will bring perfection. It's not a deviation. It's actually perfection. The personality of Godhead and his transcendental name, fame, glory, etc., all non-different from him. Therefore, all the sages, and all the devotees of the Lord have recommended that the subject matter of art, science, philosophy, physics, chemistry, psychology, and all other branches of knowledge should be wholly and solely applied in the service of the Lord. Art, literature, poetry, painting, etc., may be used in glorifying the Lord. So, when people come to a Krishna consciousness event, do they feel that these are the Brahmins? Prabhupada's whole purpose in coming to this world is not to be intellectual, be sincere and valuable in ISKCON. But the example I always give is that take like a great university, or universities. Say you go to Oxford, for example, or some like Harvard, or some American university. The fact is that most of the people in the university are not professors. I mean, there are students. There's a medical department. There is the department that takes care of the gardens and the grounds in every university. It's like Eden, they have all grounds. There's a security department, campus police. There's the food services. There's the tech services that keep all the computers running. There are thousands of people who are not teaching. And yet, if you say Oxford or you say Harvard, you don't think of the food. You don't think, oh, you mean that cafeteria. What you're thinking of is a powerful educational institution in which most of the people employed there are not teachers. So it's not that everyone in ISKCON has to be an intellectual, not at all, to be a great devotee. However, when people think of ISKCON, they think education. No. Many people think, oh, people in very exotic clothes dancing in the street. Prabhupada himself stopped the Harinam in India because people had the wrong impression. I'll give you one example from my time at Harvard. When I went, first of all, the devotees at Harvard, the devotees that go to Harvard Square, it's a big meeting place for young people. And they, so devotees go there, they beat on the drums and run around in circles and all that, jump up and down and things. And so I found, I was in the Department of Sanskrit, and Indian Studies. And I found that that ISKCON and the devotees were basically laughing at each other. I'm not saying that was right to think, but that's what they thought. It was a big joke in the Harvard Sanskrit department. So I went there and I was, by Christian arrangement, got the fastest PhD in the history of the Harvard department, which was over 100 years old. And the other students, the same students were joking about ISKCON, began approaching me and very respectfully asking, "Can you tell me about the Hare Krishna movement?" Twice, I had an entire Harvard department, the whole department, all the professors, all the graduate students came to my house to take prasadam and talk to devotees. An entire department at Harvard. Why? Because I met them halfway. It's not like you've got to come all the way to me and I'll just sit here and be spiritual. So taking details, there's something absurd about a society telling everyone all the time you're not your body, but you are your clothes. There's something just absurd about it. Of course, decent, we should dress decently, respectfully, because we're Krishna. So there is a desperate need for reform. That's certainly true in Europe. Actually, Lisbon's nice. I'm sure what you're doing in Portugal is very nice. If you look at France, my God, don't look. Anyway,
Can I ask you something, please?
Yes.
Thank you, because you are the first one person to talk about an issue who really wanted to hear about. Actually, who are the leaders of ISKCON nowadays? Because what I see the sannyasis, they are almost leaving this planet, so they are few are staying. And then, as I see, it's all concentrated in here by young leaders. Is that true? Who is leading the leaders in the ISKCON right now? It's very question between the leaders in India and the leaders in South America, Europe, like you said.
Not, ironically, my experience is that the Indian leaders are much more sympathetic.
Proficient, yeah.
And sympathetic.
Yeah.
For example, I have a lot of contact with Indian devotees from an Indian background in North America. And they completely support Krishna West. Why? Because what I'm proposing is exactly what they did in the West. That's why they have the big houses. That's why they drive the nice cars. That's why their children go to the best universities, because he did exactly what I'm recommending for ISKCON. So they, they're intelligent people. That's one difference. I mean, I don't want to be offensive or cruel, as enjoyable as that is. But still, the fact is that if you look at the Indian congregations, even in the West, let's say, they tend to be highly educated people, cultured people, strong families, and they have influential positions in society. If you look at the Western, let's say North America, I'm not going to talk about Europe because I haven't been here long enough to insult them. But if you look at the Western devotees, they have much less education and to be more fanatical. So the Indians are not the problem. They're successful. They're successful materially, and they're successful in supporting communities. And they understand Krishna West because that's exactly what they do in career. Yes.
So let's say during the Hare Krishna explosion, there was a formula, right? Like going out, distributing books, going out, chanting in the streets, bringing people to the temples, and then in the temple, prasadam, and more singing and yoga. So, what would be the formula now for attracting the world, saving the world?
We have to meet people halfway. There are places in the West where it's appropriate, for example, do Harinam. Time, place, and there. If you want to, let's say, chant in public, there are places and times when it's appropriate. There's certain events or whatever, and people appreciate it. And why are we building high cultural walls of separation? Why are we telling Western people you have to come all the way to us? We won't take a step to you. May give you a free sweet bowl, but culturally you have to come all the way to us. Why don't we go to them culturally? So,
but how should we go to them?
Well, okay.
Do we need two different kinds of programs? One for those suiting those that want to be more old school, and
I mean, obviously, people are old school. They have a right to do that. You can't tell them you can't do that. But it's not working. It's not working. I think that even asking the question and the solution is not compromise. You see, we've had such bad luck, going out and jumping around, in the West with our funny clothes. That so we resort to, okay, let's pretend we're something else. It's at least North America, where if you're going to start a program in North America, the first question you have to ask yourself is, who am I going to pretend to be? Who am I going to pretend to be? A yoga teacher, an astrologer, Vastu consultant? God only knows who wrote that book. It's not like we know that some great soul wrote it. But as I say, for every philosopher in ISKCON, there's probably 100 astrologers. It's interesting because everyone's very strict about what Prabhupada said, except when they're not. Like, for example, I was in Prabhupada's room. I was sitting right next to him when the first ISKCON astrologers in LA, they were from LA, came in trying to get Prabhupada's blessing to do astrology in ISKCON. Prabhupada said no. He said no. I was sitting right next to him. And Prabhupada said the reason was that the essence of Krishna consciousness is just to depend on Krishna, not to try to manipulate your fortune. The stars don't cause anything. It's just a newspaper. It's just the stars, it's a fact. Krishna is so brilliant. he can actually configure the night sky to tell you actually, all kinds of things. But you find devotees not crying out to Krishna, but wearing different kinds of stones as if, okay, I have this bad karma, but a stone can ward off my karma. What is that about? If you have the karma to suffer, you will suffer unless Krishna saves you. How can a stone or some mundane karma mantra stop your karma? And Prabhupada's whole point was, we take shelter of Krishna, not of all this Harry Potter Vedic culture. It's just like, it's the International Society for Hindu Magic. And that was Prabhupada's whole point. We put our lives, our fortunes in Krishna's hands. Again, if you have karma, how can you think that a stone is going to change the laws of the universe? Because karma is divine justice. How can you stop divine justice by chanting some mantra and then write a check to some, so-called life coach astrologer? And that's exactly what Prabhupada, who cares if Prabhupada said it? Not no one, that's obvious hyperbole. But there's so many people that don't care. And there's so many people that don't care. Prabhupada said that we don't care about dress. Here's a quote from Prabhupada. We are not interested in dress. Dress is nothing. We are interested in living conscious.
Isn't
Yes.
thinking about knowledge and how we can use it for helping understand our better? And you spoke about this. Is it similar with going to the hospital and taking medicine?
Clever young lady. Okay, so that's a good point, but I'll have to put a good answer. Well, we can follow the example of the founder of Charity to start with. Prabhupada went to doctors, and he was sick. He didn't go to astrologers. And so, of course, obviously, how can it be the case? Well, you could argue, your argument is interesting because someone could say, well, if I'm sick, why not just depend on Krishna? So if I have something big harm, maybe Krishna sent the stone. I'm acting as your lawyer. Done to sabotage you. Weasel my way in as your lawyer. But the tip is that the Bhagavatam doesn't talk about depending on those things. There's scientific evidence that it works. If it was actually a science, it's interesting because I remember saying natural cures, the tour of natural food store. And I remember, I think it was Time Magazine, which at the time was an important magazine. It's kind of been surpassed now in digital media, but it was a very important magazine. They actually did a study that in natural food stores, you go in there and you tell someone, I've got this pain about this condition. Yeah, I think you should take this natural thing or this tree bark. The funny thing is, they buy it. The person giving that recommendation has probably been working the store for about 8 days and know nothing about it. Someone told them. And so we have a right to accept science. So if you say it works, I think the burden of proof would be on you to present evidence that it actually works. And I don't think there is any such evidence. Yes, back there.
Before I joined the movement, I was studying very fast.
Really?
And then I joined and I met devotees. you told me Beethoven is speculation, piano is speculation. And I was,
They said Beethoven is speculation.
yeah, and I was, confused and sad because I read my life.
First of all, Beethoven is not a theologian.
I just want to say that after that I gave a lecture in Germany at class, and you gave me some understanding that this Western classical music is a good thing for my life, so I want to thank you for that. And so I would like to understand better what you are saying regarding Harinam book distribution, and you were saying I think that the silver bullet doesn't work anymore. So what is your, can you please explain
Yeah.
how should we stop Harinam, or how should we do it? Should we stop this book distribution, or how should we do it?
Yeah. Okay. No pressure there. First of all, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, Evam pravartitan chakra, the wheel has been made to turn. It's very interesting. That's literally what it means. The wheel is made to turn. And that wheel or cycle, same word essentially, is that we are blessed by God, by the devas, by the demigods, and then we take whatever we've been blessed with and we offer it back. And in the act of offering back, we create a cycle of an offering back. And Krishna says that that cycle has been made to turn, receiving blessings and then offering back. And he says, Nanu Vartyati, that means one who does not keep the wheel turning. The Gayur, their life is just an offense. Because Indriya Rama is living literally for sense gratification. And Mogan Parthasiti, the person who lives in vain. So there was actually a very widespread philosophy of art in Europe in the late 1600s and into the 1700s, which was that, let's say, you composer, Bach certainly knew this, Handel knew it. And what's that? So anyway, the idea was that if you're an artist, you could be a poet, you could be a composer, a music composer, and so your inspiration came from heaven. Your inspiration, poetry, your inspiration, music, gift from heaven. And you take that gift and you fashion it to your art and you offer it back to heaven. And that's what offers. After every piece he wrote, for the recreation of man to the glory of God. There was a the generally person considered the greatest English composer of the 1600s was oh my God, I didn't just forget that. Oh my God. No, he's Austrian in the 18th century, 17th century. Purcell. Henry Purcell, he died very young. And so they used to have in Europe a festival every year, like a religious festival for Saint Cecile, because Saint Cecile was like, a lady saint who was considered to be the patron saint of the arts. And so every year they would have a festival for her, and the greatest poets would write poetry, the greatest musicians would poetry, music, and so on. And it's very explicit in the poetry. They're very, very explicit that all of our genius, all of our art is a gift of God, and we're offering it back to God. And that's exactly what Krishna talks about in the Gita. Beethoven is usually a little more secular. That's true. However, if you can dovetail all kinds of things, devotees, some places they build temples, sometimes they buy great buildings, that were built, to glorify humanistic things, but devotees considered a great victory when they building like that. Prabhupada liked classical music. It's not all classical music, of course, but certainly up until, let's say, the first third of the 1800s. I mean, it was explicit. Much of it was explicitly meant to connect with heaven. And it's interesting because there was one, my own favorite composer at that time, Handel. Beethoven said Handel's the greatest composer, actually. And what he did was he took all these verses from the Old and New Testament, and he just did this music it just rocked out so much. It was so contemporary music that wasn't allowed to be played in churches, even though it was all about. And it's, of course, Handel's Messiah oratorio. And I mean, the music was so great that it took several years before it was allowed to be played in churches. And yet it's the greatest sacred music ever written, at least in the Western world. And so it's, in terms of to what extent was classical music secular, what are you talking about, what composer, even up to the 20th century, I forget, there's one great French composer, that was named, beautiful, beautiful sacred music. So if you compare, why not talk about Bollywood? Why compare apples to motorcycles? If you really want to be consistent, compare, let's say, Western sacred music to Indian sacred music. In some ways, I have to admit, get out the rope and hang that not the great acharyas, not talking about the great acharyas wrote, but in general, I find some Western music more inspired. Why? Because all music reflects a particular historical reality. And the fact is that Western music, whether it's Handel's Messiah or whether it's the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, is a much more extroverted, world-conquering music. And so it's not we want to subdue the planet, but it's much more extroverted. It's more reaching out to the world with great ideas and real freedom, which we know is Krishna conscious. Indian music, classical music, is much more introverted. And India was a very, introverted country. I mean, they just didn't mix with other countries. Indian culture had tremendous influence outside of India, but there was a certain inward looking, and they just did their own thing. So, and of course, then there was a lot of Muslim influence. And there was a socioeconomic reason why a lot of Indian music is the same kind of music you hear in Saudi Arabia. Because in the pre-industrial world, if you wanted to make a living as a musician, if you actually wanted to do that as a vocation, you had to have a sponsor. In Europe, the sponsors were royalty or the church. If you didn't have a sponsor, basically, you're going to have to get a day job. So in India, the same thing. You had a patron, the king, or because usually the king, they didn't have a wealthy church in India. They had Brahmins who didn't have a lot of money, but you had to get royal patronage. And so once the Muslims conquered northern India, other parts of India, they favored Muslim musicians. Even though there are obviously many brilliant Hindu musicians, but they favored Muslim musicians, and they favored Muslim style music. That's why when you hear sort of classical Indian music, it sounds a lot like what you hear in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and places like that. So what was Vedic music? We know, for some very good reasons. Perhaps the main reason is that unlike Western classical music, which at a certain point was written, they would write on scores, and then you had to learn to play the score. And when you have time, there's something to be said for extemporaneous. For example, take modern rock and roll bands or jazz bands. they give a lot of importance to just sort of, making it up as you go along. And you get very tight bands, just, like jazz bands, they just go on all night and they're speaking to each other and all that. And so that's analogous to Indian classical music, where they would, I saw this actually, I mean, it'd be nice if we actually learned something. For example, there was this concert for George. I don't know if you've seen it. Yeah, I really like that. Of course, I have to admit I watched it. But it's very interesting because they have like special features if you bought the CD or the DVD. And so in one of the special features in the DVD, they showed how Ravi Shankar, the classical Indian musician, was sort of training and preparing Indian musicians to play there at the concert. And they had also some Western classically trained musicians. It was basically Indian style music, but they had like violinists and other people. And so Ravi Shankar was becoming frustrated because the Western musicians, they couldn't like overnight pick up, which is, something which is a very old and great Indian tradition, which is extemporaneous music, where you just, you just jam together, basically. And obviously, you have a few chord progressions or whatever, or melodic lines, and so Ravi Shankar was like, his attitude is getting like sort of almost like angry, like, what's wrong with you people? but I felt like saying to him that, well, it's true. I mean, Western classical musicians don't have as much practice in jamming, especially when you're doing Indian chord progressions or very much Indian type melodic lines and so on. And so the fact they couldn't pick up right away is not like a big surprise. But on the other hand, you also don't have coming out of India a Fifth Symphony, which is just, you get these towering, gigantic pieces of music. And so, there's something to be said for Japanese contemporaneous music, like Western jazz musicians or sometimes musicians or Indian classical musicians. But there's something to be said also for taking a year or two to compose something which is just this amazing piece of music that lives on for centuries. So, but because in India they didn't have this notated music where you actually write it down. And so centuries later, we know exactly what Beethoven was doing. Or even earlier, go back to the Baroque period, go back. I mean, you go back to music that was written down, that was written just literally a few years after Lord Chaitanya left the world. So we know what Western music sounded like during the time of Lord Chaitanya. And personally, I'm really glad they wrote it down. It's really beautiful music. It's very much religious. And so,
what is the Gandharva Veda about then?
Well, if it existed, we know.
Oh, we don't know.
Well, first of all, I mean, there's a tendency in India for even devotees, Western devotees, is something is written in Sanskrit, it came from heaven. Like one thing, for example, is Vastu Shastra. No one ever asked who wrote that. No one ever asked how old is it. To give an example, Ayurveda. I'm not against Ayurveda. I'm not against Ayurveda, but I know when I was preparing to give a course on the whole history of Indian religion at the University of Florida, and I wrote a book. I read a book on the intellectual history of India. And it made one interesting point that the earliest example of speculation in Indian intellectual history is Ayurveda, because the oldest surviving manuscripts say basically, well, see what works. And so it was actually an empirical tradition. It's an empirical tradition. So, and of course, Dhanvantari Swami gave that, but how much of what Dhanvantari Swami, yeah, I like him. I don't think he wrote the Ayurveda. Although I can't say he did. But so there's just sort of this gullibleness. Even the Mahabharata, Madhvacharya, as in the so-called Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Sampradaya, although we're not really theologically that close with our story. And the idea that the Brahma Madhva Sampradaya, Lord Chaitanya never taught that, H.D.Goswami never taught that. It was only brought out when the Vaishnavas were being persecuted by Brahma. And so they fled to Jaipur. But in order to legally, with the king's blessings, be allowed to practice and teach, they had to show that they were belonged to a sampradaya. And so Baladev Vidyabhushan said, well, I was born in the Madhva Sampradaya. So, like I have an ID card from the Madhva Sampradaya. So they made the Madhva connection because at the time it was actually necessary to be allowed to preach after they were already kicked out of Vrindavan. But if you study Madhva's preaching as philosophy, in any way, very different. But in any case, there's, and again, Chaitanya and his direct followers never said that we're part of the Madhva Sampradaya or connected to it, which is interesting. So there is value in studying. I mean, we have to present Krishna consciousness, I think, and that we have to know certain things. Yes.
Just want to get one question, come back to the education point. I don't know how to think about it, but I was thinking another day about how maybe we could present our philosophy and our values as trying to connect people as not controversial, but more inclusive thoughts and philosophy. So the majority of society would see some value in what we are talking about.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course we can do that. At the same time, and if it's done right, it's a very good idea. There's a tendency for devotees to be sort of conflict because it's interesting because certain psychological traits are passed down, hereditary. Like, let's say, for example, your type of bird lives in a place where there's a dangerous predator. And so that fear of a particular predator could be another bird, could be an animal. It's actually passed on from generation to generation. So psychology is also hereditary. Certain attitudes, certain fears. And so I think that it's interesting that I think because for so many years devotees, have presented themselves in public in a very exotic way. And therefore, if someone's going to do a Western preaching program, often the first question you have to ask is, who are we going to pretend to be? And so even when you go out and you're normal, like in Krishna West or other programs like that, even if you're actually normal, you're not freaky, you're not eccentric, you're not exotic, you're not foreign, devotees still have to pretend there's something else. Like, it's yoga, it's astrology, it's that, like there's like a hereditary complex in Hare Krishna movement that whatever you do, don't tell people who you really are. And it's understandable. If I'm on an airplane, the person next to me says, "Are you Hare Krishna?" Because if I say yes, they're going to think, "Oh, you're those people that are very exotic, jump around in the street," and and no, I'm not. I mean, yeah, they're devotees. We're all part of the same movement, but in another sense, no, that's not me. I absolutely disagree with that. I believe in Harinam. I believe we should. For example, how many devotees in the Western world are actually seriously perfecting their musicianship? Whether you're doing more modern music or whatever it is, I mean, like really being good at it, not just putting Hare Krishna lyrics to what's that Jamaican music, reggae?
Oh, there's a band here. There's a band here.
Okay, I take that back. Too late. No, but if when you do, let's say you like, I mean, let's say you like that kind of. I mean, of course, it's a hobby. You can do whatever you want. This is, this is so. So, yeah, it's a hobby, sure. I mean, for example, as a hobby, just to relax and forget that I'm leader of the religious society. And I mean, literally for my health. I play Baroque, Bach, Handel, sometimes Mozart, Beethoven, and but it's a hobby. And Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, you should be moderate in your eating and also recreation. We need recreation in moderation. Otherwise, we're going to end up taking nerve pills. But let's say you like a certain kind of.
What do you have to say about the phenomenon of kirtan in the world, the entire world?
Yeah.
Kirtan
Devotees,
Melas.
yeah, devotees. Yeah, that's a very good example. I would call that Gaudiya Vaishnava dream.
I have
Because,
maybe.
no. However, it's not mainstream. I'll give an example. I mean, it's not that you're reaching society, you're reaching a very small group of people, very tiny group of people. I'll give you an example. When I was teaching at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and one day I walked out of the class, finished my class, and I was walking across the famous University of Florida Plaza where they gave out for Sean for years. And they were having some kind of kirtan, it's called, in Alachua, which is just 20 minutes down the road. And they had all the most famous kirtaniyas, which is a non-grammatical word, by the way. That's the thing. They had all the most famous kirtan leaders in the world, maybe like 6, 7 of them. They were famous. And they were all sitting on a big rug together. They were all chanting. And the total number of people that stopped, this was they were there during the lunch hour. It's not a class. And there were hundreds of thousands of students walking across the plaza in all directions. And I stood there and watched. I sort of turned on my cultural anthropology mode. And the total number of non-devotees that stopped just to listen for a moment, the total number was zero. And these were like 5 or 6 of the most famous kirtan leaders in the world. Not one person stopped. And as far as, there are certain people into kirtan in the West, definitely. It's a very small niche. I actually researched it, and the number of people in the West, say in America, or North America, the number of people who are seriously interested in culture is between 1 and 2% of Western people. So we tend to get really hopeful, but in fact, it's even declining. They used to have all these kirtan fests, and it's just not a big deal. It's not a big thing. Never in the news, you never see it. So I mean, obviously in a country that's like the United States that has 305 million people, and a lot of people who practice yoga and so on. There's definitely some people interested. But is it mainstream? Absolutely not. Like take that whole yoga world. There's a university in Southern California. Oh my God, this can't be happening. No, not Chaplin. Oh my God. I think, no, that's North of Village, Orange County, Trinity in San Diego. It's a well-known university. They actually did this academic study of who takes yoga in America. Serious study. And they found the following: 80%, 80 women. Now, it was something that was 80% men. Like, what if we just focused on metallurgy unions? It's not society in general. And then they asked people to take yoga classes, and they had them maybe the 6 top answers. Nothing remotely connected to philosophy, nothing connected to spirituality. It was about, again, women. I want a sexier body. I want to lose weight. I want to be more flexible. This is all about the body. And so this is a sign of the times, the triumph of Lord Chaitanya's movement in the West, that women trying to have sexier bodies and lose weight, they're the prime candidates for. What? Well, I would say in my I would be a realist. In other words, if I look up these things and say something different, I'd be more than happy to say I was wrong.
Low school students, they love people mantra. Even in
They also, they love just.
I asked the groups of the people on the street, you ISKCON? Prabhupada? They did not know what ISKCON.
That's the whole point. It's not. However,
so
okay, here. Well, first of all, let's see what we're explaining. No, the fact is that what's not amazing is that these people are not joining.
They're just having fun.
They're not joining the Hare Krishna movement. They're not. It's not a bridge to Bhakti Yoga. And I'll say something else. They would be equally delighted to chant Om Namah Shivaya or to chant any other mantra. They do not become Vaishnavas.
Okay, yeah, that I agree with you. But they enjoy that.
Well, people love Japanese comic books. It's like, I think that we are a society desperate for good news. We're desperate for good news, and therefore we exaggerate things. If someone is interested in kirtan, but not necessarily into Krishna, where's the relevance? Not only that, there's a very easy way to test the theory. You can do research and very easily find out of all the music that's downloaded nowadays. It's all downloaded in North America, in Portugal, in Australia. You can easily find out what percentage of that music purchased by Western people is Indian music. And what you're going to find is it's a tiny, tiny little slice of the market. And of that, people, they have, there are places in the world, in Europe, where they have these huge Hare Krishna festivals in the summer. But who joins ISKCON? If someone is interested in India, but not interested in Krishna, what's the point? We're not trying to make people Indian, but some devotees think we are. It's funny, because the Indian devotees are not trying to make people Indian. So, I wonder, what's the psychology here? I think it's actually this sort of, it's like ships crossing in the night, because you have, let's say, very successful people from the Hindu background in North America. They're very successful, they're educated people, and they're fitting in. They're fitting in. That's why they're so successful. They're intelligent. And then you have American devotees who think it's somehow a sin to fit in society they're living in. And this high regulatory attitude, it's obviously not philosophy, it's philosophically absurd. What it is, I think, is psychological. Because in the beginning of the movement, see, I think I've been talking a lot about this in Brazil at our festival, and that is one thing that practically doesn't go on in ISKCON is serious social science. Like, for example, the fact that, first of all, ISKCON, as it developed, is plan B for Prabhupada. It's not plan A. If you look at all the letters Prabhupada wrote before he came to the West, if you look at the letters he wrote when he arrived in them, it's very obvious Prabhupada's plan was. It was based on Krishna's statement in the Bhagavad Gita, whatever the great people do, come to me. And so Prabhupada was only writing letters to leaders, famous people. That was his vision, that we go to North America and if I attract leading citizens, they will, they'll be followed. And for various reasons, there was a real cultural Prabhupada was, like, for example, he wrote letters to the Foundation, the Great Foundation, saying, please support us because this is real religion. And in the statutes of those corporations, one of the first things is we don't give anything to any religious group. And Prabhupada was writing letters saying, please help us because we're a religious group. And so it wasn't a connect. So, and Prabhupada, frankly, he was alarmed at the joining. I mean, he loved all of his disciples. He loved all of his disciples. He was grateful for their service. But why did he say things? We have to say things like we have to boil the milk. He was talking about his disciples. Why did he say we have the mass, we need the class? Prabhupada was not an egalitarian. He was a very keen social scientist. Why did he say with some alarm that we're getting so many Sudras? Why did he say, for example, which he did, that there's, anyway, it's in the papers I wrote. Why did Prabhupada say there's actually no rule against having long hair or a beard? He said there's no rule against it, but I was afraid public would think you were hippies. Now, back in that time, in the 60s, late 60s, in ISKCON, and early 70s, our fondest wish is that we would be identified somehow brothers of the hippies and political radicals, because everyone that joined them was coming from that group. So we were hoping, I mean, the devotees, when they won, every anti-Vietnam War rally, the Harinam Party was there, hippie events, Harinam Party was there. They weren't going to conservative events because that's where they came from then. So you have these, the devotees thinking it's a great thing that the hippies identify with us, and Prabhupada thinking it's a disaster. And so ISKCON developed the way it developed. It's not plan A. I'm not saying we should kick people out or they're not also very valuable souls. But Prabhupada has, there's two things. There's Prabhupada, the merciful guru, and there's Prabhupada, the socio-historical strategist. A level of just being merciful, which he was, everyone that came, he loved them and he took care of them. But in terms of strategy, no nonsense clear-headed strategy to save this planet, it was a problem. And so what I'm saying is that if we're actually going to fulfill Prabhupada's desire, spread the Yuga Dharma, and save this planet, we have to go back to plan A. And when you go out on the street in very eccentric clothes and jump and run around and beat all drums, plan A is killed. So I'm not saying that, I love Harinam. I mean, Harinam is ecstatic. Time, place, and matter. That's exactly, Bhishma is glorified by understanding time and place. Narada Muni, Dhruva, you have to understand time and place. That is Vaishnavism. It is a history of adaptation. It's a history of adaptation, which ISKCON has broken. Yes.
On a personal level, what you will say and what you have experienced, that Prabhupada is talking to you, is talking to us, what you will say to you, what is your objective in spiritual life? What you will transmit to you as this most cherished desire for you, what you transmit it to you, what you will transmit to us.
That was what Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita at the very end, where he says, one who teaches this Bhagavad Gita is most dear to me. No one will ever be more dear than a person. Prabhupada was clearly trying to save a planet. And if you act in a way, even with devotion, that convinces most respectable people that you're crazy, it's not helping. It's not helping. And the Yagya, they're getting benefit. When does it manifest? Krishna says, not in this life, not in the next life. So I think that ISKCON has been crippled in the West by philosophical mistakes, by by an irrational concept of what it means to follow Prabhupada. And the Western mission is crippled. We're not relevant. We're not relevant in the Western world. And so I'm trying to help Prabhupada. I'm trying to convince devotees that we need to stop this train wreck. Prabhupada literally gave life. I was with Prabhupada in Mayapur when the doctors told him, you can't go on like this preaching. You have to stop for your health. And so Prabhupada, stopped preaching. It lasted 1 hour. It was 1 hour. Prabhupada consciously gave his life to build his movement. I mean, there's so many things that, there are temples, very major temples, I won't mention the names in the Western world, where Prabhupada explicitly said, don't make it Indian architecture. I want Western architecture so Western people be comfortable. So what do the devotees do? Exactly what Prabhupada said. Prabhupada is trying to get in the West. They have these immature get out, just bounces around, and he's always like he sent Robert a picture. He was dressed in a suit and but Prabhupada saw the picture. He said, "This is what I always wanted. This is what I always wanted. That you become famous as American Vaishnava, not Indian." And the main argument, well, it's like you need a fireman, policeman, their uniforms. That's a general argument for uniforms, but it doesn't work as an argument for wearing a dress. When you philosophically study analogy, the more disanalogies you find, the weaker the analogy is. So there are two huge disanalogies that made that argument fail. One is that if you talk about police environment, the society, any respectable person, they already accept these people as authorities. They just need to know who they are. Do people in Portugal, Germany, Canada, do people, Western people in general, already accept devotees as authorities on God, authorities on the soul, authorities on how to be happy in life, authorities on how to build a just society? It's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. Of course they don't. So that's the first reason the analogy fails. The analogy works if people already accept a group as authorities. They just need to know who they are. And the second thing is that you can't just talk about uniforms. For example, if you look at police uniforms or the firefighter uniforms, they are specifically tailored, the color, the design, particular cultural context to convey authority, and specifically the right to use force. And that's why firemen and policemen wear clothes with military colors and military type uniforms, because it conveys authority. A dhoti or a sari in Europe does not convey authority. It conveys eccentricity. And so therefore, it's just, there's this huge reservoir of bad arguments.
What about worshiping the deity?
Yeah, we worship the deity. That's what we do. Oh, the what?
What type of worship the deity?
Oh, sort of California kind. I make it a rule not to get involved with deity worship, because it's very. I personally have my own taste, and in deity clothes, and I don't like to see the deity almost buried alive under opulence garlands. You can hardly see the deity, but that's just my taste. I mean, I like to see Krishna, but yeah, I feel I don't, because Prabhupada, actually when Prabhupada gave me the GBC in Latin America, the next day he just told me, I didn't ask, he said to me, do not spend a lot of time building big temples and elaborate worship. He said for the more advanced devotees, there is preaching, books, writing books. It doesn't mean he worship, pujaris are not advanced. But he didn't want to emphasize. And clearly, we worship deities, and we all benefit greatly from worshiping the deities. But it's very different when you take deity worship as an end in itself, as opposed to saying, I'm trying to get some mercy here. I'm trying to get empowerment from the deity so I can go out and do the work.
I was referring to the pujaris to worship them.
Oh, how the pujaris should dress.
Yeah.
Oh, well, good. That's not controversial. I think we should avoid things which, to me, frankly, unless something better, they're kind of like cuckoo, they're just sort of like, for example, stitched clothing is contaminated. You've heard that? I think that's crazy. The reason I think it's crazy is because Prabhupada always wore stitched clothing when he worshipped the deity. So is there some controversy? No. Prabhupada's an example of the opposite? Yes. It's just one of the ways, and one of the many ways in which Prabhupada is ritually worshipped, but not practically followed. Or probably my favorite, even something that I really love even more than the stitched clothing thing that no one can explain, is that when you chant Gayatri Mantra, you cover your right hand. You heard that one? Okay, let's break that down. Imagine I'm talking to some educated Western person. I say, actually, there are sort of evil spirits flying all around us. But you're right to think, okay, you're serious, intelligent person. There are evil spirits flying all around us. And they try to only use nature, not at other times. They try to figure credits. But fortunately, they can penetrate naked right hands, but they bounce off left hands. Maybe because they evil spirits also use lotus and they know what the left hand is. And also they bounce off cloth, even like nylon, even synthetic cloth. So they will, these evil spirits will bounce off cotton, silk, synthetic clothes, or even your left hand, because they'll just bounce right off it. And this is the spiritual science. So rather than actually study Prabhupada's book seriously, rather than ISKCON create schools, it's just it's this kind of stuff. So.
No.
Isso aí.
It seems like
Ai, não sei como
So
é que está bem.
just to clarify, the
Se
Pujari,
calhar alguém me ligou.
like, wears
foi o logo na tribo.
Indian clothes.
Não sei se está tudo bem.
Okay, let's talk about that. One thing is Prabhupada, we have many pictures of Prabhupada sort of recklessly doing Gayatri mantra with his hand exposed to the evil spirits. And also worshiping Radha and Krishna with stitched clothing, which is like, oh my God, what Prabhupada thank you. No one has an explanation for this. It's not in Shastra. As far as clothes, deity worship is such a sensitive topic. So I'm not going to recommend, okay, is let's start wearing other clothes because you can't do that. So I'm not going to give advice on how to dress other than to say that I think as far as philosophically, how should Pujari dress? I mean, obviously, Pujari should be very clean, dress in a way that's very respectful. But for example, in India, because it's a tropical country, and a lot of the year it's just really hot, Pujaris often are bare chested. But what if you suggested in Bhaktivedanta manner that just be bare chested? Kind of like in the West would be seen as the percent approach. But in the purport I read 4853, I'm sorry, 4854, explicitly says that you can't always imitate India in deity worship. But that, you see, Prabhupada said so many things that most of the leaders in this country don't take seriously. Some things they do, like things they don't. So this thing, you just sort of you quote Prabhupada when you want, and you ignore Prabhupada saying when you don't want. I'm not saying all leaders are bad. I think they're sincere. I think they're trying to serve Krishna. Often I don't think they have a very clear understanding of certain things. Obviously, they understand a lot of things. But yeah, ISKCON has just really done what Prabhupada said not to do. Just become very ethnically Indian. Nothing wrong with it. It just doesn't work in the West. And we know it doesn't work. For example, when the CC resolutions come every year, one of the first things I get as a one of the scholars is who are the new sannyasis and gurus? Who are the new candidates for sannyas and gurus? Because that's the future. You don't need a crystal ball. Just read the GB's resolutions and see who the new generations of leaders are. And it's almost all Indians. And again, there's nothing wrong with them. They're devotees. dedicating their lives to Prabhupada. It just shows ISKCON's failing to Prabhupada gave us. Prabhupada said if you can't they have failed to preserve the one thing which will save the world. And have no plan to restore it. There's no ISKCON plan to restore it. In North America, they said, okay, they called it 335. That in the year 2035, we're going to have like maybe 3 million more devotees. People, and how do that? Yeah. These 3 million more Western devotees, or just 3 million more devotees. I don't consider that a plan. I consider that just like
Wishful thinking.
yeah, well, that was actually wishing and hoping. Anyway, you know the song? No, it's a really good song, but it's not. So, yeah, is in deep trouble, very deep trouble. For historian, scholars who study sort of like religious movements, Krishna is not new, but in the West is. Again, sometimes like serious scholars at good university give ISKCON as an example of a movement that had the resources to really become strong in the West, but failed. Scholars tend to see ISKCON as a failed attempt to create a strong Western collection. In response to that, ISKCON leadership, they have a very dynamic plan. It's just, I have no idea what it is.
Making new temples by donation.
Yeah, who gives donation?
Donation for the,
Yeah, but who's giving the donation?
the people.
No, exactly.
I don't know.
In America, for example, there are building many new beautiful temples. They're all Indian temples. They're all Indian temples. There are no new Western temples. In North America, even Europe, in North America, there is no longer a single large-scale ISKCON festival that's Western. They're all gone. New York used to be, and all the sannyasis, it was like the big meet ground. All the Western sannyasis would come. And, the New York Rath Yatra, I went there 2 or 3 years ago, gone. There is not one large-scale Western festival in the Hare Krishna group, not one. A festival that attracts a lot of Western people is done to attract Western people. They're all gone. Every major city in the Western world, with very few exceptions, there are no major Western temples anymore. I mean, there's some Western devotees, but you talk about all the big cities, New York, Chicago, America, Detroit, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. I mean, just go down the list of major North American cities. There are no big Western communities anymore. No big communities, no Western festivals. What's that? Alachua? Yeah, I was the actually DC when from working with Alachua, but if you ask the simple question, but that's being done by a very small percentage of the devotees. I give them a lot of credit to active schools. But if you ask, here's the Vaishnava community. First of all, is it a community? Or is it a group of little 2,000 devotees together, mostly ISKCON devotees. What's a community project? There is there's no preaching project where the larger community, not everyone, but that's we have this large community and so our project is there is no.
Woman will carry out for the 10,000 years. So I feel it's devotees like moving in the spirit package and
Thank you. Well, it's fine because I just haven't changed. But what we talk now, it's like yeah. We always young leaders. That's what no, just forgot to
No, it just came out.
that's what happened. You get lost on mic. So I think leaders are reasonable. But okay, I'll give you my Italy analogy. You heard my Italy analogy? Okay. No, not. It's the okay. If you look at the Roman Empire, or even the Roman Republic, they were like the master organizers. They were the master organizers. If you look at I don't know the century it took, or most of a century to conquer Italy. The Romans were great team builders. It wasn't just brute force. I mean, when they needed brute force, they had it. But it was their team builders. And they created the largest unified empire practically in history. And yet over time, it dialectically went to the opposite, where Italy became a centralized country in Western Europe. And so you have these extremes of centralization leading to an opposite extreme, where they just have city states. So ISKCON, I see also sort of succumbing to that historical dialectic. Because when Prabhupada was here and after Prabhupada was here, it was like, I mean, I remember a time many years where literally it was considered offensive for any temple except the president thing. Anything. I mean, just to have an original idea. And so it was, I mean, you get these young people and, they couldn't hold their liquor of power. You give a lot of power to very young people and just, they get drunk on it. So what happened is Islam was so, the big book distribution revolution, it was so much like this militant leadership and everything that it then went to its opposite. So we have a Western Hare Krishna movement incapable of forming large-scale projects. If you look at Italy with the city-states, that's ISKCON. They're just city-states. There practically aren't even any functioning zone. Because when the center of your whole temple community deity worship, like, what's the zone? They don't have December puja marathons. And so ISKCON is now in the West. Maybe I don't think maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I'm not sure I am. ISKCON is now a society that's capable of forming large-scale projects. Because it went from one extreme, sociologically very heavy, presidents, GBCs, gurus, that, you're not big thing, moving for you. And then it went from that extreme to the opposite extreme where there are no large scale projects in the Western world. There's not even zones anymore. I mean, technically there's zones, but zones just mean some GPC responsible to make sure everyone is, doing the puja properly, or treating the donors properly, or holding the proper festivals. It used to be that zones would unite. I mean, that's what I know because Prabhupada told me that. When I was sent to Latin America, and it just boomed like anything. And before that, if you were to in Latin America, it's like, opening ISKCON, Neptune or something. I mean, you were just, no one had any idea what was going on there, no one cared. And then suddenly this big zone formed by Krishna's mercy. So it came down December Marathon. It must have been maybe 75. And Tamal Krishna brought a number party. They were like, no, so we start sending our results in, and we start going up, and then suddenly Latin America was a champion of the world. And so then, right in January, right after, I flew to LA to see Prabhupada. Krishna also flew to LA to see Prabhupada. And so Prabhupada, he loved it. He loved these big results. And of course, Tamal and I were like brothers. It was just, and so Prabhupada, it's funny, he said to Tamal, but in his own way of English. But really what he was saying is, so you're gonna take that? What are you gonna do about it? It was, and we were all laughing. So Prabhupada stopped, he said these words I never forgotten. He said, I like this competition. There's no competition. I mean, there's a book distribution newsletter. And also, because it's understood in most places in the West that, what percentage of people, first of all, don't throw those away. That right there. Because, I mean, there are several places in North America where they're like temples that they go and they just collect thousands of books people throw away. Same thing in the LA airport. The book distribution. The airport were used to devoted or a book, which made financial sense to those. So, for example, no one in the Western world, all sell the books. There doesn't seem to be much interest in how many people read the book. No one really cares about who reads books. It's just selling in itself. If you sold the book, that's it. You sold the book. Did they read it? Did they devotees? Not relevant. The sale ended itself. You can't have a successful religion. It just doesn't work.
I said, you said, simple like model, can't be understand it. So it's enough just to stand a philosophy like we're doing here now, or we need to work to actually understand probably and apply it.
It would help, I think, not everyone has to do this, but some devotees to be aware of what's going on in the world. And what is our response? Like, this is what's going on in the world. What do we say to that? What does Bhagavatam say to that? What does Krishna say? It's just like devotees don't really see a need to, I mean, it's like occasionally back to Godhead, they'll have a story on some modern issue or something. I remember devotees when they first started doing that. A lot of devotees in there called it Pop Goes the Gita. Pop goes the Gita. It's like it's funny they have these back articles talking about some problem in the world. An ancient text called the Bhagavad Gita, and then it just became Gita class. But we need to stress education. Like I said, not everyone has to be a scholar, and obviously most aren't scholars. But ISKCON does not stress scholarship, it stresses rituals. ISKCON in many ways has become the religion that we left.
You are,
A very good example.
yes.
I don't know, it was perfectly said.
Yeah, we feel it, yeah.
Can you say it again?
We feel it.
Yes, for a price. I said that, I was saying, yes, I'm in this for the, it's, the ISKCON in many places has become the religion that we left to join us. I remember when I was a young brahmachari in Berkeley, one of my lines, I used to always say that this is not just like some religion, ritual, and everything. It's a science, spiritual science. But as it turned out, it's not an institution that focuses on spiritual science. It is about the rituals. So if you go to most temples in the world, certainly in the Western world, let's say on Janmashtami, or any of the days, or Purnima, there will absolutely be an Agnihotra. There will absolutely be a Abhishek. Even though Prabhupada never said these things were very important. There absolutely will not be intensive education. Even though Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita 4:33 that serving me through knowledge is much more important than rituals. And then he says, Tadvidhi pranidhatina. Still, exactly the opposite is emphasized in the temple. It's interesting because it's a very ancient tendency where people who live in cities and there's money, and they tend to just do rituals. In fact, ancient India years ago, there was a group of Brahmins who were intelligent, and they became dissatisfied with just all the ritualistic approach in the cities, palaces, and so they went to the forest. They went to the forest and they composed different kinds of, and the literature they composed is called the Upanishads. So, I mean, the same thing happened in ancient Israel, where, like in Jerusalem, the city of David, there was a lot of rituals, this huge temple, a lot of money, and so they began to discuss and they go to the wilderness just to practice something like ancient Jewish yoga. And the only place really where there was wilderness in Israel, a small place, was a place that no one wanted to live, the Dead Sea, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so this thing about, I mean, in ancient Islam, there were a lot of people who were really blind and they were satisfied with the rituals and everything. So they started a new way of being Muslim with the Sufis. So you always find this actually throughout the history of religion. You find that people in general tend to become ritualistic and just want to, pay to play, where save your soul by making donations and doing rituals. And then you get people who are more thoughtful and they rebel against this and they form communities within religion where the emphasis is on knowledge and strict practice. So it's a sort of a universal historical trend. And so now we're seeing ISKCON turn into a heavily ritualistic society. Again, take any fiscal year and just ask a simple question: how much did ISKCON spend building temples and rituals, and how much did ISKCON spend building schools? How much did ISKCON spend awarding scholarships to bright young devotees so they can become powerful, educated preachers? there's just tiny amounts spent for education, and no amount is too great for rituals, temples. And my last thing, I want to get my last insult here. But, there's a very important verse. The Bhagavatam begins, Archayami Mahaye Pujam Japsadhyayate, that if someone undertakes to worship Krishna, but Archayam Eva, Archa is the deity. And so Archayam Eva means only in the deity one. You only worship Krishna one. Archayam Eva Hare Kudang Jakshata Yehate Nata Bhaktishu Chan Yeshu. But that person does not worship the deity in the hearts of all living beings, the devotees. Then the Bhagavatam says, don't preach. Tad Bhakta Prakrita Smrita, that devotee is on the material platform. So someone that just goes to the temple for rituals and doesn't really take interest in saving the world is on the material platform. It's not a liberated person. That's in the Bhagavatam. And of course, it matches perfectly with the first, second class devotee. And Kanisha means literally in Sanskrit, lowest. Lowest. Oh, if anyone's interested in linguistics, in Sanskrit, there's actually basically two fundamental ways you can have superlative comparative degree, like good, better, best. And to make the superlative degree, it still survived in English. Because in English, you say like the fine S, the pretty S, the wise S. So the ST is a suffix making the superlative degree. Same in Sanskrit. So Ishta, ST, which means the lowest. Anyway, it's interesting. Grammatical point. So, I mean, it's not that we don't build temples. It's not that we don't worship the deity. I mean, we do with love and all that. But where's the balance? Where's the balance? ISKCON, you know, in its sort of, you know, money, which is a very old story. It privileges, you know, third class devotees because they get more money. And they, you know, ISKCON temples reinvent themselves to get money from third class people. I mean, they're not bad people, evil. They're just on the material platform. And ISKCON happily reinvents itself to get their money and build big temples, which brings more money. Where are the schools? And we have some kids' schools. Dallas has a nice school. Actually, Richard Kishore did an excellent job there. And Malacha has two very good schools. But that's it. That's it. Thousands and thousands and thousands of devotees in America in free schools for kids.
And how do you see these courses of Bhakti Shastri, Bhakti Vaibhava?
Yes, it's very good if you want to be trained to preach to the choir, as they say. You understand? I mean,
Yeah, preach to the choir, preach to the birthday.
Yeah, if you want to, which is necessary. I mean, adult education is kind of good, teach the Shabbat, but as far as I know, they do not teach us in a way that empowers you to attract to Prabhupada's mission. That would happen.
What do you mean with saving for not forever? Because it's a cycle of nature.
Right. That's an intelligent point. Please don't make it. Yes, it's okay, saving the world, a bit hyperbolic. I would say that it means fulfilling Prabhupada's vision. we are trying to establish the Yuga Dharma. The Yuga Dharma. So of course not everyone will be a devotee, of course. And the Earth planet won't literally sort of float off into Vaikuntha or something. But Prabhupada's vision was that Lord Chaitanya's movement would become a very powerful spiritual force on this planet. So, see if I get away with that re-articulation. Yes.
Thank you, Maharaj, for doing this important clarification. And I agree with you that book distribution is not the end, but we need to follow up and reaching to people, connect to them.
And also, just to add one point, if we actually sold books that most people could read and understand, it would be a great thing. So what I'm concerned with is not how many Prabhupada's books did you sell, how many people did you bring to Prabhupada? So what if it were the case that, let's say, give people books that you actually understand, that would actually read, that at the end, more people would come to Prabhupada. To me, that's the number. I know in Gainesville, I was giving Bhagavatam class every day. And a lot of people are listening, actually, a lot of listening groups are listening every day. And I was reading, of course, we were doing the Sanskrit, reading Prabhupada's translation of Purport. And I was just remembering just how sophisticated it is. There's all kinds of paradoxes. There's all kinds, a lot of Prabhupada's Bhagavatam purports assume that you know a lot, that you know the Bhagavad Gita, that you know other parts of the Bhagavatam. It assumes that.
And the English was different.
The English was different, and all kinds of statements which, we can understand, but not a new reader. And so, when Prabhupada was here, he used to always complain that even his own disciples would read his book. Some were. Obviously, those were more eminently inclined. They read Prabhupada's book. But many, many devotees weren't. And they just couldn't, it was hard to get into it because they weren't intellectuals. So the idea that you just you see all these pictures of happy people walking away with a big set of books, and there's just no interest. Like, how many people read the books? How many people became devotees? No one seems to care about it.
I really like what you said about making the effort to meet the people instead of them coming to us. And I felt like a very good example of that was when we did the African preaching. We would go into the tribes, dress like them, with the hats and the.
You dress like an African chief.
Yes. And his writing that he was so revolutionary in his books and his approach.
He was trying to reach people.
Yeah.
All of us, our own way of doing it, but he was trying very hard to reach people.
And he even formed that scientific group in America where he reached out to the intellectuals. And they became devotees, not even knowing they were devotees. That they were ISKCON.
Actually, when he was a new devotee, he traveled with us. And we used to, and he was always exceptional. But
yeah, we're very close with him because I'm from South Africa.
Oh,
so
right.
We grew up in Africa.
Oh, yeah. He was. I remember when we met, and then
he used to wear a wig, right, and go and
the library party.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think did I explain that? How that happened? I started the library party. He was a brahmachari in our group. We were traveling around preaching. And I was in Prabhupada's. Where did I tell this story?
You told me this morning.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was in Prabhupada's garden in LA, and he said, "Are my books in libraries and bookstores?" And I said, "Not so much, Prabhupada. Probably a lot of people won't take there." And I found out that was the wrong answer. So Prabhupada made it very clear, wrong answer. So then I told Prabhupada, okay, we'll do it. And then I went out and, I sold the first set of books to the library. And then he and Mahabhuti, they were brahmacharis, they were just doing secretary. And then Prabhupada asked me to go to Latin America, GBC, so I turned it over. Satrup took over my place, and then of course that's when Dahshan, as he was called then, and Mahabhuti, they really, they just did amazing chiefs. So maybe we'll take rest now. So I travel. I have to go to the airport. I get to the airport at 4 o'clock tomorrow.
Yes.
Oh, you go ahead.
Yeah, so we are here doing mentorship programs for book distribution, the trying to maintain Harinam. What is your suggestion? Like, I have faith in doing Harinams and all of this. What is your suggestion for the strategy for us?
It's, of course we should do Harinam, but time and place. Prabhupada stopped Harinam in Gaudadesh, in Calcutta, because people thought the devotees were just beggars, because in West Bengal and the other parts of India, low-class people do Harinam just to get money. So when the public misunderstood, Prabhupada stopped it. So I think it's a great idea to chant the Maha Mantra in public places at the right time, in the right place, in the right manner. And I personally just don't think that devotees doing that. Like I said, in Harvard, devotees doing Harinam in Harvard Square, and they were just, they were like a big joke at Harvard. But if you presented it culturally, just you make a beautiful presentation. We absolutely should do Harinam. It's very powerful, but it should be done right. And I don't think it's right to go out dressed as a Martian. When I was at, it's funny, one time I was in the Harvard faculty club, and because there was a professor in the Sanskrit department, she was from Italy, and so we were friends. So we were going to have lunch together in the faculty club, and it was a couple weeks before Christmas, and so they had this Harvard choir group, it's probably like 8 people. They came into the faculty lounge and they were singing like Noel, 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 something, Noel, and other songs. And so it's funny because they had all these stuffy Harvard professors and philosophers, and they thought they didn't have permission to like it, because it was religion and everything. But I was just into it. I loved it. And, they were singing beautiful singing, and nicely dressed. And so I turned to this friend, this Italian lady, and I said, I already like this. And she said, if you understand Italian, io sono italiano, mi piace. I said, I'm Italian, I'm going to cry. And so, and then everyone's funny, so all the professors started putting their newspapers down and everything. They're like, okay, they have permission to enjoy it. Mm-hmm. So it's funny, last point, and that is, as far as public outreach, of which Harinam is one form of public outreach, it's an important form. Devotees don't, the one situation where devotees really care about public taste, and all that, is when the devotees are putting up their own money. Like, let's say, for example, you open up a restaurant, Govinda's restaurant. The devotees are actually spending their own money. They're very concerned about public taste. Like if they put something on the menu, it's not selling, then they take it off the menu. If it turns out there's another item that everyone likes. In other words, ironically, when devotees have their own money involved, they really care about what the public likes. But when devotees don't have their own money in the game, they don't care. It's all Gyata Sukriti. Ironic, isn't it? Well, thank you all for.
Yeah.
Well,